Hi, welcome to class on September 20th. You will have a couple things to do today to make up for the fact that we're not meeting in person. The first thing is I have this PowerPoint, and so you can go through this, and I'll just go through the things that I would have talked about on the PowerPoint. The second thing, I would like you to go to the link that I have to the discussion board for the vocabulary activities you did. Post your vocabulary activities. I'd like you to read each other's. If you want to comment on them, you can. I'm not going to put a requirement that you have a certain number of comments on the vocabulary poems and stories and stuff like that that you did. I am going to also add a discussion link to this PowerPoint, and so again, I'm not going to require, but if you have any questions or comments and you want to put it on that discussion link, you can do that, and then that way it's almost as if we had class, where if I was going through the PowerPoint and you had comments or questions, I would have obviously answered those in class. So hopefully we can get as close to the class experience as possible. So today, talking about vocabulary strategies, and I am going to cover all early elementary and later elementary, so we can look at the whole range there. The first thing, the number one thing that you need to do is exposure. That's how we pick up vocabulary. And it's really, it almost sounds like it's too simple, but it's really the number one strategy, the biggest thing you can do. Read to the students and have the students read. You need to have as much literacy in your day as you possibly can. Make sure that you use good vocabulary. It's a good idea to use some of the higher vocabulary words, especially if you use them in conjunction with the simpler vocabulary the students might already know. So if you're trying to talk about a certain idea, you might use the word minuscule, and then you'll use the word small right after that, and they'll start to pair those words together, and they'll have an expanded vocabulary. If you listen to home environments, and if you listen to families that have maybe a higher educational background, you'll hear that that's what they do with their children oftentimes, and so the kids start to pair these higher level words with the lower level words, and they start to build that meaning around it. So we need to make sure that we do that with kids too. Sometimes you can get vocabulary lists that are genre specific, so maybe science or social studies. Sometimes some districts, I know the Eastern UP at one time had a list of suggested vocabulary words per grade, and those lists were based on Marzano's research. It's pretty interesting. You'll see math, for instance. Students need to know that there's more than one way to say add, sum, add, addition. You need to teach them all of those words, because what we found is sometimes when kids go to take a test or an exam, they might know how to do a certain process, but they don't understand the vocabulary word that goes with that. So making sure that they have a varied vocabulary. It's a good idea to use a lot of the official words. Again, math and science. Maybe use the official terms instead of only simplified terms. Same thing with grammar. You might start off talking about a verb as an action word, but you also want to use the term verb. So all of those little pieces, that's what I mean by using good vocabulary. You want to expose students to new experiences and the vocabulary within the experiences. So this is where you come in with maybe having students really dig deep into certain interests or areas. So if you have a student that's really into trains, there's a lot of vocabulary in that, and so maybe they're going to do a ton of reading on trains, and they're really going to dig deep and get to know all that genre-specific vocabulary that has to do with trains. But then you want them to expand that a little bit. You don't want them just to stay in the stuff that they already know is cool. Maybe if you have a student that's interested in trains, maybe you can introduce them to another related topic. Trains, I'm thinking of maglev trains. Maybe you go and you start talking about some alternative movement and you can kind of branch them out into some other areas. Sometimes it's whole class, and maybe living in the Eastern UP, they're not that familiar with cities. Maybe you do a unit where you talk a lot about cities, or you talk a lot about different countries, or there's lots of ways that you can do this whole class to get kids to expand their vocabulary past what they're going to hear on a day-to-day basis, especially in a rural area. Same thing, if you were urban, it'd be the same thing. Urban students, they're not going to know as much about farms and some of the rural things that we have up here, so you would do the same thing with them. The wrong way to teach vocabulary is to have them write a sentence containing the word. For instance, if you wanted them to know the word or words cell membrane, they could write the sentence, the cell membrane is part of a cell. That's a correct sentence. They use cell membrane appropriately, but they don't necessarily know what cell membrane means. I mean, that can be pretty useless. We've all had experiences, I think, with that, where the teacher gave us a list of words, we had to define it, use it in a sentence. If you can, most kids, they can figure out the part of speech. If they can figure out the part of speech, they can plug it in a sentence where it makes sense, but they have absolutely zero meaning. So be very, very cautious about using this technique. It's an easy technique, it's easy to give, but the students, it's mindless, and they really don't learn from that. Some ways that you do want to teach vocabulary, if we look at K3, word walls. Word walls are really good. And you might even want to have more than one word wall. Maybe you have one that's sight words or, spelling, writing words. You might have another word wall that changes. That's maybe based on your science unit or your social studies unit. If you're doing a genre study, then let's say you're really working on folk tales. Maybe your word wall is going to be specific to folk tales, and maybe that word wall changes. So you'd almost do like a bulletin board. When you have word walls, it's really important that you encourage kids to use the environment around them. So when they come and they're like, I don't know how to spell this. Okay, well, what clues can you look around and find? And so you encourage them to use those word walls, and that helps them to expand their vocabulary quite a bit. Anchor charts are another. We saw some examples of that in the video clips that we watched last week. If you have anchor charts and you're talking about power words, and maybe you have an anchor chart where you're kind of keeping track of the power words if you're doing certain books. And so students can refer back to that. That links to the next bullet here, pointing out power words when reading. We want students to notice those, and that's a good technique to do all the time. It's just always having them note the power words, those really good words, the nice phrases that make you think, the longer words. The example I'm thinking about is from that the clip that we saw with gosh, I can't remember the story now, but they were talking about growl or grunt or said, and so I think it was a little red hen. And so using some of those alternate words gives you more meaning, and so that would be a power word. Have students note the words and phrases they like when they're reading. So you might do this whole group, and then you have the students do it on their own, and they can put that in their notebook or their reading logs, so they kind of keep this constant ongoing thing of words and phrases that they like. And then when they do their writing, you encourage them to use those words. So that's making the words real. They're incorporating it into their writing, they're incorporating it into connections, and it's more likely to stick with them than simply having them define the word, write a sentence. They're actually using it, and it's going to be easier for you to tell if they're using it in the appropriate way. Also note all this interaction between teachers and students and students and students. Interaction makes things stick as well, and it's easier to correct misunderstandings and make sure that they have a true understanding of what you're talking about if you're having a lot of interaction. Grades 4 and up, I would still use word walls. I'd probably go more with a genre and subject specific word walls. I can remember one fourth grade class I taught, we had to use open court reading, but one of the things that we did is we had a bulletin board, and based on the stories that we were reading, the students were expected to post words, phrases, newspaper articles, pictures, all kinds of, like pretty much anything that you could find that was related to the stories that we were reading. And the stories were usually linked by genre. So, it helped to really deepen the understanding of the story, and they were more aware all the time of looking for specific things that would link to what we were reading. So that goes a little beyond the word walls, but again, deeper meaning of vocabulary, because they're looking for pictures and other things like that too. Have the students use the words in a variety of ways. You don't want them just to, again, read it and define it. You want them to use it in their writing. You want them to use it in their speech. You want to use the words. So the more you use those words, the more you encourage them to use the words, the better it's going to stick. lots and lots of writing. Grades 4 and up, they're going to be doing lots of writing. So having them, again, incorporate those words into their writing. Performances. You, in that vocabulary packet you had from Monday, you could see that there were some of the examples they gave you could do as performances. And it takes time, but the kids are really digging deep and they're going to remember. And so maybe have them act out certain words, or, act out certain terms, and that's going to help them to remember it. And the interactive bulletin boards, I already mentioned that, link to the word walls. Pictures are good, especially as you get up into the higher grades. Some of the stuff is a little bit more abstract, and so you might have a picture of somebody doing something that signifies that vocabulary term. And so again, that helps it to stick. Another very quick and easy tool you can use is Google. If you click right in define, colon, and then the word, Google, they'll define it. Sometimes if you click on that, you can get some different definitions. So if they don't understand the first one, they can find some others. There's sometimes images or videos attached to that. So it's similar to looking it up in a dictionary, but it's maybe a little bit more interactive. I wouldn't just use Google and stop, but I would use that as part of an overall piece as I was looking throughout. All right, so that is it for vocabulary strategies. I hope you had fun doing the stories and poems and the different things that you did for your vocabulary activity. I can't wait to read that, and I look forward to seeing you on Monday. Have a good weekend.